All right, welcome everyone to the Avoiding Pitfalls in Logistics Technology Decision Making webinar. My name is Marshall Hughes and let's get cracking. So if nothing else today in our short time together, I hope you'll be better equipped to ensure that you avoid some of the pitfalls in logistics technology decision making and have some strategies to deal with them. There is a Q&A button that you should have access to. Please feel free to enter questions as we go. And I'll either answer them on the spot or we'll save them to the end. Today, we're going to have a quick look at the 5 key pitfalls, and I'll talk about those in a minute. I'm also going to introduce you to the mind map that we provide. And of course, at the end of this, you'll get the link to grab that for free if you want to dive deeper into this area. So without further ado, let's get going. So the first thing is the mind map. The mind map has 10 nodes that provides a comprehensive overview of the process we follow. Each step includes a video run through of some of the detail that we go into. And as I said, there is a link at the end of this. The mind map is plenty to go on and should give you a really good sort of deep dive overview on how we make decisions and some of the pitfalls that we have to avoid as we go along. So the 5 key areas we are going to cover today are integrations, being you talking to different systems, security, and we'll talk about a number of different areas within that, future-proofing, this concept of how are people going to judge us down the track, essentially. So how can we ensure that the decision we make today is still valid in a few years' time? And then I've split costs, which is probably the biggest thing people ask about. I've split into 2 distinct areas, the upfront, the investment you're making in the beginning, and also talk about the ongoing costs. Because depending on who you are and the nature of your company, there's really good reasons to maybe bring costs forward or to push them onto later. So let's get rolling. So integrations, we break into 2 areas, which are internal and we also talk about external. So internal, we talk about legacy systems and plan systems. So broadly speaking, integrations in 2020 are quite simple. Most software now can talk to other software. What we need to be wary of and need to avoid is the response from a software salesperson that they can integrate, because sometimes those integrations have a bunch of hidden dangers or hidden traps within them. So when we're talking about legacy systems, we're talking about your internal systems that you already have and you're going to maintain once this new system has been rolled out. And when we're looking at legacy systems, a couple of the key things to look at are the export and import capabilities. So your existing systems need to talk to the new system. How are they going to do that? How are the files going to be shared? And how are they going to be read and imported? This could be something very simple, such as a CSV file that is automatically produced, or it can be quite complex, and you might hear people talk about webhooks and APIs and everything. The key thing here is that you need, if you're going to retain existing systems, you need to be able to talk to them and you need to be able to do it easily. A trap here can be relying on third-party dependencies such as Zapier, where essentially a different piece of software that you have to pay someone else for becomes a crucial part of the system because system A has to talk to Zapier, which then talks to system B. We talk about costs later on, but sometimes these things look really simple and cheap on the beginning, but once you dive into them and if you start putting through 10,000 or 100,000 transactions a month, they can quickly ramp up in cost. Another key thing to look at with existing legacy systems is the data quality for your legacy systems. So garbage in, garbage out is the thing we talk about. So if your existing system is going to be talking to the new system, how can we be sure that data is going to be correctly managed and is clean, so to speak? And a really interesting example of this is that the people who map our DNA have had to go through and rename a whole bunch of parts of the DNA because an Excel spreadsheet somewhere turned a whole bunch of numbers into dates. And these are the sort of things we have to watch out for when we're integrating legacy systems. Another aspect of legacy systems is the expected lifetime of your legacy system. So how much effort do you put into building for an existing system to integrate when that new system might be due for replacement in 12 or 18 months? So do you look at a Band-Aid or a stopgap measure to get you through the next 12 or 18 months? Or are you building something that might be 5, 7 or 10 years? And the final thing with legacy systems is to look at the future functionality. So you've got a new system coming in to replace something or augment something. You've got a legacy system sitting in the background. Is the legacy system going to be the same system in 3, 5 or 7 years' time, or will that expand? And if any of you are familiar with the likes of SAP, sometimes you can be bolting on and bolting on and bolting on, and it's hard to remember what you actually started with. So when you're looking at that integration, just ensure that the map that the corporation is on is reflected in the map that you want to build with your new system. And the thing on sort of tangential there, we talk about planned systems. So looking at the current scope, the current rollout plan, are you building something or trying to fix a problem that's not going to exist in a little while? If you're trying to solve a problem with drivers being unable to upload a proof of delivery from a device, but there is a new system coming out in 12 months that will incorporate that or remove the requirement for proof of deliveries from drivers altogether, just be careful at making decisions that will then reflect badly on you in the past, because you're going to start mothballing some of the new technology you've introduced. Another thing with planned systems is to figure out and understand in the business where your planned new system is or new technology is in the company's priority. So are you going to be able to get the resources, whether that be internal developers, data entry people, or management support, to ensure that the rollout for what you're trying to do is going to be proper? And just make sure that when it gets to the stage where you now want something to talk to you, is someone else already ahead of that, and you're going to have to wait another 12 months to get your integration done. And finally, with planned systems, look at the additional requirements. So ensure that whatever your decisions you're making, take into account that someone at some stage has already got authorization to introduce a new inventory management system in 12 months' time, and you're going to have to be able to talk to that as well. So the decision you're making now needs to be for now, but also needs to be for the foreseeable future. When we talk about external integrations, and this is the one that people mostly focus on, I break this up into suppliers and customers. The challenges are quite similar between suppliers and customers, but usually where it becomes a difference is who's more important to whom. So in both areas, we talk about existing and planned capability with your suppliers and customers. We need to talk to suppliers and customers and find out what they're doing now, what they're capable of now, because what they're actually doing for us or what we're doing for them now might not actually be what they really need or what they really want. They may have built something to deal with the fact that we're unable to do certain things, or they may be working on replacing their existing functionality to be able to work with us. And then if we go and change what we're doing and we haven't spoken to those suppliers and customers, then someone's going to look a bit foolish and someone might be a little bit annoyed. We need to look at where we rank on both sides. So how much effort is the supplier going to be prepared to do with us as a customer to integrate whatever decisions we are making? And to flip it, how much work are we prepared to do for our customers to ensure that they can do the integrations? Integrations with suppliers and customers can get really messy, especially if you start looking at endless aisle type technology where everyone can see everything that's going on at every stage, right from production to when a customer might pull something off the shelf. So we need to be aware of what those capabilities are going to be, and we need to ensure that with multiple systems talking to multiple systems, you're not going to get almost tied down in too many conversations going on at once. So what steps can we skip? What steps can we augment? How can we make it transparent? How can we make it easy to use? But perhaps, are we risking our own relationships? Are we risking our own IP? Just need to be really careful on what's doing that. Cost comes into this. We will cover on cost later on, but cost covers into this because at some stage, someone has to pay to get stuff done. So are we going to pick up the cost? Are our suppliers going to pick up the cost, or are our customers going to pick up the cost? And this comes down to that relationship discussion again, who is more important to whom? This even affects the technology you use, because if there's a system that 9 out of 10 of your top customers are able to integrate with, then that's got to be something that weighs on your decision. It doesn't matter a whole bunch of other factors. It doesn't matter how good it is, but if that thing might be most important to your business is just keeping in touch with those good customers, you've got to rank that as part of your decision-making process. Again, integrations, probably the most dangerous thing about integrations, the most dangerous question you can ask anyone is, can you do something? Because the answer to that question is always yes. Yes, we can do this. Yes, we can integrate A, B, C, D, et cetera, et cetera. The questions we need to be asking are how, when, and how much. So how are you going to do this integration? Well, we're going to integrate blah, blah, blah. When? Well, we can't do that for another 2 years. Or how much? Yes, that's fine, we can do it, but it's going to cost you $2,800 a day for an engineer to write it, and we think it's going to take them somewhere between 3 and 6 months to do. So rather than can, we've got to be asking how, when, and exactly what's going to be done. So moving on from integrations, we talk about security. So security, I break again into software and hardware, slightly different areas, but the principles are the same. And the principle that we will talk about a lot is asking stakeholders questions. So knowing the information before we go down the path of making a decision about new technology is critical. So we have to know what we're talking about. So software, without getting into technical detail, there's a whole bunch of different places we can host. So is it local software on a device or on a server in our own building or on our own premises? Is it cloud, such as an Amazon Web Services or a Google Cloud where it's hosted goodness knows where? Or is it a hybrid, whether there's a local software component, but the data might be stored elsewhere, or the operational part might be local, and there might be different data stored at different locations. The challenges around all those are quite similar from a conceptual point of view, but the questions you have to ask the vendors do come quite different. And you need to be knowing, so let's talk about where the data is. So there's onshore data and there's offshore data when we're talking about clouds. Now I'm talking at the moment in Australia. So we're an Australian company, for example, where is our data going to be held? And with so many service providers that we use in this country being US based, is our data going to go to the US? Because that raises a whole bunch of questions around data ownership, data sovereignty. So is it your data? Is it your country's data? Who else is able to have a view with it? There's some countries in the world where you may not want your data to be located or accessible at all. So when we're talking to cloud and hybrid providers, we need to know what they're doing with the data and where it is. We need to know that when things go wrong, are we a big enough and important enough market for those offshore providers to provide us with the service level we need, to provide us with the security we need when things change? If you're in Australia, there's questions around government access to your data. There's questions about data retention policies, depending on what business you're in. If you're hosting or you're based in Europe, you've got the GDPR, which is the data protection for individuals that you might have to worry about. That includes such things as any individual has the right to access all their own data and have all their own data deleted. So depending on what you're capturing, where you actually store it may increase the things that you have to do to remain compliant with local laws. So it's just something to be aware of when you're looking at which jurisdiction you're going to be putting your data into. And this all depends. Sometimes it's easy to get too bogged down in security, and you may have some C-level execs that you're reporting to that are really big on security. You need to be able to answer these questions. You need to be able to have the discussions with the vendors to say, why should I be worried? What are your security protocols? Who's got the data? Who gets transmission? If there is a conflict of interest between my data provider and the company I'm trying to run, for example, I might be a car parts provider, and I might not want my data stored on what is one of the biggest marketplaces in the world for secondhand car parts. I might be worried there might be some sort of potential for that company to get access to it. You may not be worried about this, but your customers and your suppliers may be worried about this, which again means that these are discussions you have to be having with all the stakeholders in the business to ensure that you don't get a crossover. You're not worried about either perceived or actual conflicts of interest, perceived or actual access to your data. You just need to remember what's going on. Physical security. So this comes down to some real basics like don't share passwords for people logging into PCs. And it's those questions around how does the new software you're getting, how does it prevent from that sort of thing from happening? How does it automatically log people out after a short amount of time? If a device is not accessed for 24 or 48 hours, does it wipe the data clean? So what's happening with that physical security of the actual device? If it's a laptop or a PC and whatever else it is, how are they getting in? A lot of people now with device security have one password to get them into their laptop, for example, and then everything else is free range. And that might be fine for your company, but it might not be as well. So it's important just to know about that. If you're storing data locally, how is it possible to access that server? Is it possible to steal that server? And what would happen if someone did? Where is the data that is stored locally backed up if the building burns down? It could be tape drives. It could be someone pulling out a solid state drive every night and swapping it into another one, or it could be a cloud or a hybrid backup. So just ensure that you can answer these questions. How is that being treated? So I mentioned social security. What I mean by social security is the ability to prevent your software from being socially hacked. The most basic one of this might be someone receives an email from the post company, says, hey, listen, we've got some good news about your parcel, click here. You click here, and then suddenly malware or a virus is completely starting to wipe your system or access it. Or as in the case with one of Australia's largest transport companies this year, you could be subject to a massive malware attack where it starts stealing all your data and threatening to publish that on the dark web. So what are the protections within your software to stop that from happening? What's the protection that if someone calls up and says, hi, I'm from support, I'm here to help, I just want to check that what your password is, can you tell me? How is that prevented within your company? So this could be two-factor authentication, it could be a whole bunch of rules. It's probably the hardest one to protect against because people make mistakes and the hackers are pretty clever. But you need to have a strategy for it, and the software you're employing needs to have the ability for you to block users, give access to users, or even look at what might be unusual behavior. For example, should your system be being accessed from the Ukraine? If the answer is no, then we need to be looking at that. So moving on to hardware. Hardware is both easier and harder to be secure about. You can hard code some really easy things around it, but also you've got to make it usable. So, requiring a user to enter their password every single time they log into a device is not realistic, because at some stage they're going to start using 1111 as a password, or they're just going to stop using it and you'll get resistance from people internally. So your hardware needs to be smarter than that. So a couple of areas we focus on with security around hardware is device tracking. So if it's your hardware, where is it? And you should be able to identify that at any one time. Here we're talking about mobile hardware, obviously. If we're talking about a warehouse management scanner, then we can be pretty confident where that is at one time. But some options around device tracking of hardware are remote termination. So if a driver reports they've lost a PDA, a personal data assistant, then you should be able to terminate or lock that device remotely. If you don't know where a vehicle is, if you've got some telematics that are giving you an unusual response, the vendor should be able to help you with these things around that security level. And to be honest, that's mostly the reason you might put telematics or something in, is for that security. They need to be good at it. But it can't be onerous. So you don't want to have to pay someone thousands of dollars a month just to be able to track your own vehicles, if that's not part of the solution you're looking for. So device tracking, so around hardware, just knowing where it is. Bring your own device is an absolute minefield now for all of us in any industry, especially with so many people working from home. We've got people using their own laptops, their own computers, their own iPads, their own phones to do all these things. That's great, because from one side it means we don't have to train people on the hardware, and we don't have to be responsible for the servicing, the maintenance of the hardware. The flip side is that we now have to get people using it on whatever device they like. Is it an Android platform, an iOS platform? Is it Windows? Is it Linux? Is it Chromebook? Whatever it might be. So from a security point of view, that creates a whole bunch of different questions, because how do I secure all these devices? How do I ensure that Marshall, who's working on his own laptop, isn't copying all the stuff off my own database and onto his own personal account? Not that I would, but how are we ensuring someone doesn't do that? Then you've got your cloud apps and your shared apps that people are accessing through their own device. How much access do they really have to everything? Have we got that locked down so that a user level person on their own computer can't access information they shouldn't be accessing? How do we prevent people who've brought their own device from potentially accessing malware again, and us getting a denial of service or something through that because of a mistake that someone made at home when they're watching Netflix when they should have been doing some work? So there's some challenges around security that we have to be able to cover. Your software or your vendors or however you're going to shape your hardware should be able to work with that. The other challenge around BYOD is in onboarding and departure. So someone's brought their own device. we're now responsible for that device while they're using it, but then they leave. How do we ensure that we get our information back off that hardware and it wasn't copied or it wasn't taken? So that can be a challenge as well. Another thing to talk about with hardware in general is batteries, which now become our responsibility as well. Are people flying? Have they got multiple batteries? Are the batteries leaking? Just something to be aware of. Perhaps a safety check or a safety audit on a regular basis, just to ensure the devices are in good condition. Also want to briefly talk about device hygiene overall, especially under COVID, under the current scenarios. Key things here are sanitization, screen protection, and perhaps even keypad guides. So just ensuring that whoever's device it is, if anyone else is going to use that device, it's got to be cleaned properly. There's a number of ways you can have peel off screens. You can have some sort of actual physical cleaning going on. You've got to be careful that people don't destroy hardware when they're trying to clean it. Some screens you cannot spray, and just make sure that if it's not waterproof, it's not being cleaned in water and whatever else. But it's a key thing now, because now it's our responsibility. So when you're bringing in the new hardware, when you're making a decision to port to a new system or however it is, how is that device going to be cleaned? Because we're hyper aware of COVID at the moment, but this isn't going to go away. This now concept that we need to clean more is not going to change. So you just need to be aware of that as well. So moving along to future-proofing. So future-proofing is this concept of, in 3, 5, 7 or 10 years time, someone is going to look back on the decisions we made and they're going to judge us. And they're going to say, was this a great decision? Or, oh my goodness, what were they thinking back then? So we'll break that up into software, hardware, and vendor stability. So starting with software. Scalability. So scalability is this concept that this software you're deploying now needs to be able to be used when you grow massive. And you might not grow massive, you might not believe that's the trajectory for your company, but you may get bought or you may buy another company. There's a whole bunch of reasons where you might go from 10 or 100 users to 1,000 or 10,000 users. And does the software have the capability to do that? And again, if you ask a software vendor, can it? They will say yes, but the question is how? Because certain database setups don't work if 10,000 people are accessing them at once. And some database setups are too complex if there's only 100 people accessing it at once. So you've got to find the right balance for the company that you're in to ensure that the scalability of it works for whatever scenarios there might be for you in the future. Second thing we talk about with future-proofing is support life. So especially with software, how long are they going to keep looking after you for? We'll talk about costs with this a little bit later, but even just from a conceptual point of view, for example, Windows is a good example where they were running Windows 7 for 20 years. So that's pretty good lifespan for software. The question about whether people should be using software for so long is a different one. So the support life of that was quite long. But with your vendor, how quickly are they going to dump and run? So how quickly are they going to say, well, listen, you bought version 3, we're only looking after you for 18 months. Or we'll look after you forever. Version control is another thing to look after. So when you've bought the software, are you going to have to continually be upgrading that software or adding things onto that software to keep pace with what the market wants to do? What's going to happen if you have certain users who are running version 1.1 and other users on 3.1? How is that controlled from a business point of view? What happens if people are running different versions? Are there any downsides to running different versions? Are you going to have to buy more hardware to keep up with the new versions? Are you going to have to replace all the computers in 3 years' time because no one will be able to run what you've decided to get hold of? And then coming back to our thing before where we talked about the integrations, are there software tools that your provider is relying on right now which are maybe out of date or maybe coming to the end of their life? So are you going to have to invest in other software to support the software you've got now? This is going to be quite vulnerable if you're using an open source technique, because some of the stuff that's sitting on GitHub or on a library somewhere, no one may have looked at it for 5 years. And it may be great because it just works, but at some stage something might change, which means that doesn't work. So how dependent is your software on that? And is it something where you're not going to be able to use this after 5 years at all? Scalability, lifetime support, and version control. So talk about hardware. Hardware, same sort of challenges. So hardware can last a long time. or it can last a little time. And it's going to depend on which part of your business you're buying for. Is it a vehicle? Is it a PDA? Is it something for the warehouse? Is it the computers? Is it the phones? Is it whatever else? And a really critical thing that people often overlook in hardware is interoperability. This is the ability of your hardware to work with the rest of the business. So you can have these silos within a business where you've got people using iPhones, but the business being run on Windows. And then if you're bringing in new hardware, your new hardware's got to be able to talk to both the iPhones and the Windows PCs because you don't know what the user's going to be using. So it's important to look at what the nature of the business is, what different parts of the business the hardware is going to have to interface with potentially, and how easy can we make that? And that can become, it's as easy as, it might be something like, from a hardware point of view, for example, you've got the Ryobi One, where everything uses the same battery. That's great. So our hardware is already using the existing battery, the existing chargers, the existing plugs. That works really well. But now we're going to be charging from USB-C instead of USB-A. What are we going to do there? We're going to have to go and buy more chargers, et cetera, et cetera. Just something to look at. What are the abilities for that hardware to work with the other parts of your business? And again, coming back to that supplier and customer discussion, how can we work with those suppliers and customers? Hardware redundancy is really, really important. What happens when it breaks? What happens if some of the devices aren't working? What's your fallback? So it's great to buy 100 of the bright and shiny new things, but if all 100 of those bright and shiny new things stop working, what's plan B? So plan B might be, I've got 100 of those bright and shiny new things sitting in a cupboard somewhere. That's great, but that was a really expensive way to deal with it. So talking about hardware, talking about the support from the supplier, talking about the requirements to do whatever it can be. If the hardware fails, what's my fallback scheme? Because unfortunately, hardware will fail. Doesn't matter what it is, who you bought it from, or how much you spent, hardware fails. The good thing about hardware is that it works on what's called a bathtub chart. And I don't know whether you've seen this, but it's essentially hardware, when it fails, either fails straight away or very soon after it's first deployed. So you can imagine a graph with a really high failure rate, then drops right down to almost zero chance of failure for most of the lifetime of the hardware until it starts to fail at the end. Another way of looking at lifetime expectation or bathtub chart is planned obsolescence. So when you're mixing that up, when you look at the hardware decision, what's it going to work with? What level of redundancy? What's your plan B with the new hardware that you're bringing in? And what is the realistic lifetime of what are going to be? The failure to consider this, especially with hardware, is that you can spend a lot of money on stuff that might become bricked, which means it just doesn't work at all. And you can dump a lot of money really, really quickly if you're not aware of it. The final part of future-proofing is vendor stability. So here you're buying either hardware or software from a company. How much confidence do you have in the fact they're still going to be there for the lifetime of the product? And this is really, really critical because you don't want to drop a couple of $1 million on some hardware only for them to go broke in 6 months' time. Now, you can never fully insure yourself of this, but doing some basic research and being aware of the challenges around the different vendors will mean that when something goes wrong in the future, you can at least say, listen, well, this is the plan we implemented, this is what we looked at, and I think we made a good decision. So the two main things we look at. So startups, especially in tech now, there's a new startup every day in logistics technology. There are thousands and thousands of startups, different people coming up with different ideas or versions on a theme. Startups can be really exciting to work with. They can be very cheap because if they're in growth mode, they're not particularly worried about making short-term profit. And they can come up with some solutions that you've never thought of and no one has ever thought of. It can be massively awesome, cutting-edge stuff that will solve all your problems and you just can't wait to do it. The problem with startups is the failure rate of a startup is massive. So 9 out of 10 startups won't be around in 3 years' time. So when you're looking at those startups, look at who they are, who's backing them, what other customers have already jumped on board, and talk to the startup salesperson about what happens if the worst case scenario, your funding gets pulled and you're no longer going to be around. And it's going to be a risk versus reward. Do I go with the startup because they've got the sexiest technology that will solve all my problems forever at the right price? Or do I go with an established player? And established player is almost the opposite. They're less likely to go broke, but not completely unlikely. As we've seen right now with COVID, companies going broke everywhere. they're less likely, but they're also less likely to have innovative brand new solutions as well. So the compromise here between a startup and an established player might be better security in the long term, so better stability from that vendor, which is great, but you might not get the complete solution that you want. You might have to make some compromises on that. The other flip side is startups are going to love you if you jump on with them early, because you're going to be one of their early customers. You're going to be bringing something new to them. You're going to be validating their business model and validating their software, as glitchy or as challenging as it might be. The established players might be massive and they might not care that much about you as a company. So these are the balancing acts you have to do between the two. Something I like to look at always, whether they're established players or startups, is the partnerships they've got. So who else is validating that they are a business that we want to be working with? Whether it's something like a sticker on the website or a partnership with a Microsoft or with a Google, a trusted vendor or a trusted partner. Who have they got deals with? Who does their support? Who have they built it on? And what happens when stuff breaks? Just look at what their network and what their alliances look like, and that'll set you on the right path. Okay, let's get to costs. So we've got upfront costs and we've got ongoing costs. They seem pretty simple, but they are absolutely tied together. And this is where, unfortunately, this is where you're possibly going to be judged most harshly, because you've been given a budget and no one wants you to go over budget. No one wants to go over budget on the initial setup, and no one's going to budget on the ongoing costs. So quickly, let's talk about setup costs. The first thing, and I say this with all love and respect for salespeople in the industry, but they will trick you. So vendors oftentimes will lead with, this is what the cost is going to be, but the cost isn't the whole cost. It's not giving you everything. It's giving you the best case scenario. The cost will be, if you don't have to do anything else, this is what we can sell it to you for. This will be your installation, your setup, your data transfer, all your charges to go on with. The clearest example of this is if you go to most software as a service vendors, and they will have a pricing page if you can find it. And you'll see that there are usually 3 or 4 tiers of pricing. And the typical thing has a whole bunch of awesome features down the left-hand side. And then the 3 or 4 different versions. There's the really, really cheap one, perhaps even free. Then there's the next one, then there's the enterprise or corporate version. What you've got to look for there is how much stuff are they jamming into the enterprise and corporate version that you really, really need, but can't afford to pay for or can't afford to set up at the beginning. So just look for those tricks there. Another cost that's up front is your internal costs in bringing this up on board. So you may need to upgrade hardware and software to make that happen. The new system might only run on Windows 10. And if everything you're running is still on Windows 8 or something older, you're going to have to upgrade. And if you're upgrading a Windows, you might have to upgrade the PCs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It might require that the existing software, when we talked about integrations before, the system will work, but it only works with the version of the existing software you don't own, which might mean an upgrade over there as well. So these little costs, they do add up. And when you're doing your table of the risk versus reward, the benefits versus the downsides, it's really important to look at those areas as well. The final thing to look at, which is often forgotten, is the onboarding and downtime, which is a cost. Taking your system offline, taking the company offline, running over the weekend, all these things do cost, and you need to be building that into your model at the beginning, because at some stage, someone's going to ask how you paid for that or how you intend on paying for that. So training is another thing to look at. Is it a big learning curve for your staff? Do you have to train super users and then everyone else is fine? Is there training people can do in their own times? What's going to be the cost of that as well in time lost while your people move on to the new system? And even in the data transfer, which we talked about earlier with the integrations, if I've got to rebuild an existing database to enable the new system to work, what's the cost internally in doing that for my company? So the ongoing costs, this particularly relates to software again, but depending on whether you're leasing or buying the hardware, there might be some issues around there too. The first thing is subscriptions and license fees can be massively, massively complex because there's so many variables involved. So your subscriptions and licenses will include things like service level agreements, rebates for service level agreements, guaranteed uptime charges, discounts if those uptime charges aren't met, and a whole bunch of other hidden charges which are directly related to the fact you're bringing on new software. And this can include the thing we talked about earlier with the Zapier type service, where there's another software that you're now dependent upon. So not only are you paying $20 per user per month for your new software, but you've also then got to pay $500 a month to enable this other thing to work as well. And these things do add up. And sometimes the extra charges related to the software you've bought on your licensing and subscribing can be more than what you end up paying. There's this term now called SaaS fatigue. So essentially people just get tied up and signed up to way too many different services, doing a whole bunch of other things. You just got to be really careful about that. Subscriptions and licensings, they should be simple, but they're not. And some of the variables you'll see are in these flexible models where you can pay per user, per seat, per active user, per licensed user. There's different tiers of user. So you might have super users, administrators, editors, customer service, sales. There might be a whole bunch of different things in there. And then a bit when you put all that through the model, goodness knows what you're ending up with. So there's just some traps to avoid. One of the things here is most people will only use sort of 20% of the software you've just bought. They'll use 20% of the capability. So really build for that and budget for that, and ensure that you don't allow too many people to have too high a level of access. Especially your execs. Your execs will like to have full access to everything, but they're never going to need it. They're never going to use it. They're never going to check in. But you might end up paying $100 a head for them when it could be getting away with $20 a head, or they might not even need access to the system. So just have a look at those things you might need to do. The other ongoing cost will be, as we talked about with hardware becoming redundant or becoming running out of its lifetime, are you going to continually have to upgrade your hardware through your business to enable whatever you've just bought to continue to work? And this can be a whole bunch of different things. What does it plug into? What does it talk to? What does it do that is causing your business to incur other costs along the way? All this stuff has to be done. And if it's an important enough piece of hardware or software to replace, you're going to have to do it anyway. But you make yourself look much better without the business, and you make a much better decision if you're able to compare across the different options and see what the actual cost is going to be over the next 3, 5, 7, 10 years and whatever else. The final cost which I want to talk about, which we usually ignore, is the cost of doing nothing, or the cost not to change. And this is something that's really handy to build into your document early, or your case study early, or your case early if you're trying to convince people in the business that you need to do this. Because the question is always going to be, well, what if we just go with business as usual? Why do we have to change? You know, Windows 7 has worked for the last 20 years. Why do I need to upgrade? And the more comprehensive your case here can be, then the easier it'll be to push this along. And some things to look at here are the supplier and customer resistance. You might get to the stage where you're just too hard to deal with as a company if you don't make the change. So that's great. You've saved $1 million because you didn't buy the new hardware or software, but now you're losing business, or the suppliers are putting up your rates and charges because you're just too difficult to deal with. You're too much of a challenge to deal with. The second thing to look at is the widening tech gap. So if you make a decision right now not to do something, two things are going to happen. Is the old system just gets older, and the rate of improvement in the old system will slow down over time. Meanwhile, the new software or the new hardware or the new system that you want to be on continues to get better, but actually initially it gets better faster. So new upgrades come out, new capabilities, new ways of using it. And over time, that gap widens. And the big thing that widens there is the cost to change widens. The cost in getting out of your old system, the cost in getting into the new system, the cost of doing the integrations, the cost of changing the data, because you've got more and more data building up. So it might be that to spend $1 million now might save you $3 million in 3 years' time. And that's something you need to be able to figure out, because one of the things you're going to do as well as part of your decision-making is you're going to look at a budget for failure. So if we don't make this change now, what happens? So then you look at the existing systems, existing software and hardware. If that fails, if you don't make the change at the time when you want to do it, and you're forced to make the change later on, what's that going to look like? What's disaster recovery going to look like with the old systems? So being aware of this initially, and you really want to make the change, will help build that case. But also, if you decide not to do anything, which is a perfectly valid strategy to do in some cases, at least having that budget building or accruing as you go along will mean that down the track, when you do need to change something, then you're able to change something. So wrapping up, So a couple of key things we talked about. One is that these areas often cross over. None of this happens in isolation. The integrations are related to the costs. Security is related to ongoing costs. Future-proofing rolls across another one. There's another 5 areas we can talk about in the mind map as well. The fundamental thing, one of the fundamental pitfall is to when people don't talk to everyone. They listen to the salespeople, they listen to the people who are crying out for change, they don't talk to all the stakeholders. You've got internal and external stakeholders, and you need to talk to them, or at least make them aware of what you want to do. Especially with the external ones, because they may have had other vendors or customers who have made similar decisions that you're going to make, and they can say, oh my goodness, don't install company-wide software because in 3 years' time you'll be up for this. So asking those questions and being open about what's going on. Also looking at what your competitors are doing. Don't be afraid to ask. Go to a couple of networking events and say, listen, we're thinking of switching to company B. What happened when you guys did that? It'll either be a great experience for them or it'll be a poor experience for them. So there's been a couple of questions come through while we've been going, which is great. If you've got any questions now, feel free to hit me, or I'll just answer these couple that we've already got. Sure, so one question, are there any technologies you think we should stay away from? Yes, my answer to that is yes. In particular, I would stay away from anything that seems too good to be true or is being overly hyped. So an example of that would be blockchain, which I'm still not convinced about. I'm not convinced it's any better than the existing technology. Blockchain is almost a solution looking for a problem. It seems cool, and it seems having this independent way of validating everything is great, but Bitcoin takes so long to do one transaction, whereas Visa does 1 billion transactions a day. In supply chain, I can see some opportunities for blockchain, particularly in food, where I think it's quite exciting, where I can go to a restaurant and know exactly what's on my table, but I'm not sure that's for everything, for every industry. I'm not sure the existing patterns don't track that. QR codes is another one, or 2D barcodes or 3D barcodes, what they're called. I think, again, some people have got some technology and they'd like everyone to use it, so they just like to sell that. Would you recommend leasing or buying hardware? Yeah, so I'm not a CFO. I think that is a question for your CFO, and it's part of the business model that you'll bring up. I think that whichever decision you go with, you need to have the likely lifetime of the hardware in particular. If we're talking about leasing, you need to know what the lifetime is going to be, and whichever decision you go with, the budget's got to stretch along that. It's no different from a company leasing cars or buying cars outright. You make a decision around cash flow and a whole bunch of things. One thing to bear in mind with tech is, depending on what you're buying, you may be looking at 3 years' time or 5 years' time with 0 actual value left in that product whatsoever. And that is something that your CFO will work with and help you make a decision. You do see from time to time some buyback options, but you're usually paying for the buyback option in the lease or in the payment scheme anyway, because the tech company is not going to do anything with the end of it except recycle the parts as well. So I wouldn't get too carried away with those sort of things. Sure, so no other questions? Yeah, that's fine. So just if you want to have some thoughts later on, just shoot them through to me on an email. That'd be cool. So the mind map link and code. So I will send this to you afterwards so you can have a look at it. But the mind map is at logisticstechnology.askmarsh.com. The mind map's quite complex, but there are 10 videos to guide you through the different nodes. You'll see some of the stuff we covered today, along with other things about research and a whole bunch of different areas. It's definitely worth checking out. And you get it for free. So just when you go to the store, just dump in the code AskMarshWebinar, which I'll send to you as well. And you can take it from there. I'd be really interested in your feedback on that. The mind map's pretty new. And if there's anything missing from it, I'd be really, really pleased to get your feedback and hear what's going on. As we wrap up, this is broadly the services we offer. So it really depends on how much you want to manage internally with your current team and how much you want to get help from outside, to the degree that you might perhaps want a fully outsourced solution. One of the key things to remember from AskMarsh is that we are tech agnostic. So we don't take commissions or incentives or payments from any of the service providers that will talk to you on your behalf. I believe that it's not possible to be truly independent while being on a kickback from someone, even if it's just a couple of tickets to the footy. It's not the way we play. It's not the way you get true independence. So really, I'd like to thank you. 45 minutes, we're almost on time. I'd really like to thank you for giving your time today. Whoops. And sorry, I didn't mean to close that. It's been great talking to you. I'll send all the information through later on, and we can take it from there. Thank you very much for your time. I've been Marshall, and have a great day.